Now, social media jealousy refers to people who struggle with obsessive jealousy and whose jealousy is triggered through social media. And the reason social media jealousy is such a problem is because there are specific types of information that we know provokes jealousy in people. It's not going to be surprising. I'm going to sound like Dr. Obvious in 10 seconds, but that's
Mm.
vague information, it's ambiguous information, and it's information that is open to interpretation.
Welcome to Candid Minds with Dr. T. I'm Dr. Tamir Aldad, addiction psychiatrist and CEO of Mindful Care, the first ever psychiatric urgent care committed to providing affordable and accessible mental health care. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to be discussing social media jealousy with my good friend and well known therapist, Darcy Sterling. Now, discussing social media is really interesting because we've seen it evolve through several generations, platforms such as Facebook, to Twitter, to TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat. And depending on which platform and which generation is using it, the impact is different. But the common denominator across all of them is that it certainly has an impact on mental health. And what we see is there's some sort of dopamine hit every time you scroll, every time you look at pictures. And as you engage with these platforms, what does that really mean long term? We talk about screen time with children and limiting screen time because of the mental health consequences. Uh, and it seems like there's a strong emphasis on whether or not using social media can impact us personally in the way we function. But what's interesting and probably discussed less is how does it impact our relationships? And Dr. Sterling and I will discuss this today, particularly around a concept that she coined as social media jealousy, which is the idea that using these social media platforms can create a sense of jealousy and negatively impact our relationships. So, certainly excited to discuss this topic with her. We'll also talk a little bit about the effects of social media on depression, anxiety, any other comorbidities or existing mental health issues, and how they impact and trigger individuals who are sensitive to seeing situations, seeing other people's lives around them, and if they are sensitive, how do they navigate those triggers? So I'm excited for this conversation. She is a very, very talented individual. She's a licensed clinical social worker. She was on the E Networks show, Famously Single. So you might recognize her from there. But her strong passion and what she spends most of her time is talking about healthier relationships and how do you build those healthy relationships and how do you use social media in a way that doesn't negatively impact your rapport with others. We also touch on another topic that she's very familiar with, which is obsessive jealousy. And then that's the idea of crossing from what might be a normal, appropriate reaction of jealousy to one that is unhealthy. So, lots to unpack. Very excited that she's here, and I'm excited to share this interview with you today. All right. I have Dr. Darcy Sterling today joining us to continue this conversation about social media and jealousy. Dr. Sterling is a licensed clinical social worker here in New York City. She's also the host of E Network's star show, Famously Single. So we're excited to have you on the show, Dr. Sterling. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Tell our listeners a little bit about some of your work.
So I'm a licensed social worker, as you mentioned, in New York City, and over the years, I have unintentionally found myself teaching relationship skills. My first half of my career, I worked with teenagers and their parents, and much of what I was doing was psychoeducation, where I would teach parents how to communicate differently and more effectively to their kids, and teach kids how to behave and communicate more effectively towards their parents so that they could have the kind of freedom that they actually want. Um, Later in life, as we branched out into New York, we started off in New Jersey. I think you're in New Jersey. We branched out into
Mhm.
New York about 10 years into our practice. And we started working with young adults, and I found myself repeating the same skills and teaching the same skills. And so essentially, what I do is I teach people relationship skills. I do it individually. I do not work with couples. I work individually and I teach people relationship skills because essentially, no matter what somebody comes to a therapist for, it's going to be about interpersonal relationships, whether it has to do with work, whether it has to do with their platonic friendships, whether it's an intimate friendship. Teaching relationship skills seems to me to be the common denominator among the people that I work with for breaching the gap between where they are and where they want to be in life. And that's how I help people enhance their lives. I teach them how to love better so they can live better.
No, that's awesome, and you do great work. One thing that's interesting about relationships is the amount of data points that you have now to evaluate a relationship is significantly more than you had back in the day, right? At the end of the day, you would assess and judge a relationship from your one-on-one interactions, and then maybe a couple of phone calls, and that's enough to connect the dots, and those are your data points. But now you can assess and judge a relationship and judge someone's character by a lot more data points, such as looking at their social media, looking at their LinkedIn and seeing what they're doing professionally. How are they showing up on Instagram versus Facebook? Are they the same person across multiple platforms? Are they different people across multiple platforms? So your ability to judge the relationship suddenly is heavily influenced by so many data points that you otherwise normally would not have. And one thing we talked about is jealousy, but I'm curious in your experience in your work, have you seen people challenged by navigating those data points? And particularly, are people kind of drawing the wrong conclusions? Meaning you have a couple of pictures, you have a couple of posts, and you're trying to connect the dots and create a theme that may or may not really be there. And then that becomes your reality. And now you're responding to that reality. So what have you seen and how are people navigating that?
I think that in our attention compromised society that people do a quick vetting of potential matches or potential people that they're dating, and I don't think that people go deep on it. I think people
Hmm.
do a cursory, quick overview. Um, we find what we're looking for in life. And when we're about to go on a date with someone who we've not met before, who we may have matched with on a dating app, we're looking for confirmation that the person is going to be okay. And we don't tend to go much deeper than that. People tend to go deeper than that as they get more skin in the game and as they confirm that this is somebody that they are interested in and that they do want to explore a relationship with, that's when people start doing some of the deeper discovery work. That's been my experience with my clients.
Interesting. So there's this confirmatory bias in the beginning, right? So you're effectively looking for the data points that support your theory, especially if you're head over heels over someone, you want to find data that supports that. So you go on that date, you pursue that relationship, you double down on that relationship. When does that turn into jealousy, where now it's kind of unhealthy use of social media, and you're clicking, and then you're seeing who their friends are. Now you're clicking on their friends, and then from their friends you're going to their friends, and now when do you go down that rabbit hole?
So first of all, I want to step back for a second and just clarify that in order to talk about social media jealousy, we need to explain a term that I coined called obsessive jealousy. It's not in the
Mm,
DSM, but it should be.
okay.
Jealousy, as you know, is a normal human emotion. We all come out of the womb capable of feeling that emotion as we do all the emotions. It only becomes a problem when a person becomes preoccupied by their jealous thoughts. They're interrupting their ability to focus on what they need to be focusing on throughout the day, and it interferes with their normal daily activities. It's the same I use the same criteria for obsessive jealousy that you would use for addiction, for diagnosing
Mhm.
addiction in someone. And I call that kind of jealousy obsessive jealousy. Now, when we think of obsessive jealousy, we're thinking about two things. We're thinking about the frequency of the intrusive thoughts and feelings and the intensity of those thoughts and feelings. Now, social media jealousy refers to people who struggle with obsessive jealousy and whose jealousy is triggered through social media. And the reason social media jealousy is such a problem is because there are specific types of information that we know provokes jealousy in people. It's not going to be surprising. I'm going to sound like Dr. Obvious in 10 seconds, but that's
Mhm.
vague information. It's ambiguous information and it's information that is open to interpretation. So when we think about the types of information that we see on social media, it's all vague, it's all ambiguous information. And what that does is it creates a neurological feedback loop in our brains, keeping us
Hmm.
searching and wanting more information, kind of in the same way that a slot machine keeps a gambler engaged, wanting to play longer, hoping that they're going to get a hit, even when the odds are against it. It's the addiction that no one talks about. And again, the
Mm.
types of information that provokes jealousy is when it's lacking context and it gives you like a half story. So that is why when somebody struggles with obsessive jealousy, anytime they go on their partner's Instagram feed or whatever social media
Hmm.
outlet they're on, whichever platform, they're combing through posts that where they're seeing people who have commented on their posts, and that is the very thing that the research confirms provokes a cycle of jealousy in person. The partner's feed is like a breadcrumb trail um,
Mm.
of half steps that they've taken throughout the day. But that's just it, because you never get the full picture on social media. Your brain keeps hunting for answers, as a way of self-soothing, but it's unable to fully self-soothe the vast majority of the time. It rarely gets complete answers, and that's how it keeps us engaged.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. You're almost like insatiable, right? It's never satisfying. You're always chasing it. And I love your term obsessive jealousy. And it definitely speaks to me as an addiction psychiatrist. And I want to run with that for a second. So, in addiction, we either have models that talk about abstinence, and then we have other models that talk about harm reduction, where you could use, we discourage it, but we understand that it's a part of sobriety and recovery. So if we run with that analogy, do you think that people who know social media is triggering and they have this obsessive jealousy that you're talking about, is the abstinence model the way to go? Should they take that harm reduction and maybe use it responsibly if that's even possible? What is your perspective?
So it's hard to imagine somebody in today's society functioning without social media.
Hmm.
That said, asking someone who struggles with obsessive jealousy to moderately and mindfully engage in social media is a little like asking an alcoholic to use alcohol mindfully. Ultimately, it depends on where you land on the obsessive jealousy spectrum. And if you're curious about where you land, I have a quiz that you can take. It's called jealousyquiz.com. You go
Hmm.
there and you're going to answer a series of questions, won't take very long, and you're going to get a score. You're going to know where you land on the obsessive jealousy spectrum score. Now, I'm not testing for normal levels of jealousy, usual levels of jealousy. And I'm also not testing for jealousy when you're in a relationship with a partner who is provoking jealousy, because that's another variable that we want to rule out early on. Um,
Almost appropriate, maybe.
yeah, no, because there's a reason we have that emotion, and it's
Hmm.
because we've evolved to understand threats to our resources, and our partner is a
Sure.
resource. Our partner is something that we want to make sure remains available to us. We see other threats as we see other people, potential partners as being threats. So again, I wound up building a social media course. I wound up building a course on romantic jealousy because I was seeing a rinse and repeat of clients again and again and again. Most people come to me because they want help in their relationships. Either they want help in an existing relationship, or they want to date. They want to date more effectively. So they come to me, and shortly into the work, either they've disclosed or I've determined that jealousy is an issue. It's the kind of thing where if I had had a course to send people out to, I would have just done that, but there was none. So I was doing a rinse and repeat of the same 10 to 12 tools again and again and again, and it just became incredibly, it just became a waste of time. I finally cobbled together a
Repetitive. Hmm.
course, right? I've cobbled together a course, and in the process of researching how to create an evidence-based course that had the potential to be evidence-based, which it now is, um, what I saw in the research was so many arrows pointing towards social media as being the biggest throbbing trigger there is for jealousy. So we've got this issue where somebody is struggling with jealousy, and they also probably have to use moderate or mindful amounts of social media, and so I had to create yet another course specifically for social media. And
Mm,
what that employs, like I drew from addiction therapy, from addiction theory, I drew from attachment theory, and I drew from, drew from DBT therapy.
mm,
And put together a course that comes at it from all the different angles so that slowly over time an individual can understand what their specific triggers on social media are. I mean, the first thing you have to do in treating somebody who has social struggles with social media jealousy is you have to get them to acknowledge, to see how looking online is not providing them with the self-soothing that they're intending. So the structure of the program takes someone through the entire process, kind of like the 12 steps. I mean, I definitely did not follow the 12 steps, but the 12 steps are there for a reason.
mhm,
And the goal of my course is that the person should be able to use social media mindfully at the end. I see social media jealousy in much the same way we view the ancillary AA or 12-step programs like Debtors Anonymous, Overeating Anonymous, sex
sure.
and love addiction. You can't not do those things. There is no way of surviving without eating, spending money, and loving people, or having
Mm,
sex. So we have to teach people how to engage in those activities mindfully. I would argue it is much easier in an abstinence based program, but that's not the situation that we have when somebody's struggling with jealousy. They're going to be triggered. We can't tell them, oh, don't just go to the bar, just don't go to the bar, or just clear out your house of alcohol or whatever substance it is. You really have to. You have to teach the person how to live in a world where they're going to be triggered, and that's what I endeavored to do with that course.
that's huge, and I salute you for taking that on. I think it's really great work. There was this, a lack of resources in the social media addiction and internet addiction as a whole space, and it's still in its infancy in many ways. Um,
100%. Yeah.
but there are so many parallels, right? We talk about people being pre-contemplational, meaning they don't even realize they have an issue, or they're contemplational, they're considering doing something about their issue. A lot of those terms apply really nicely to what you're talking about,
However, I will
and
tell you
yeah,
that people who struggle with jealousy, they know it. They're not
mm,
confused. There's no pre-contemplation with this. People
interesting.
know because before I built the course, I crowdsourced and I asked people on social media, if you're somebody who struggles with romantic jealousy, if you raise your hand and agree to let me interview you so I can learn all the ways in which it impacts your life and how you discovered you struggle with this, I
Mhm.
will give you the course for free, which I then got like dozens of people, very brave people willing to do that. And they were kind enough to spend hours, each of them hours with me. And every single one of them knew. It's not lost on them that they struggle with this.
Mhm.
In fact, it's a shaming point. Nobody
Yeah.
wants to be dramatic or to feel out of control. People who struggle with romantic jealousy, they know it. Now, sometimes their partners don't know that. And that's usually when the person struggling with it is female. Women have really great skills at hiding it. Some of the women have worked with over the years have struggled at the end of the spectrum, at the most intense levels of obsessive jealousy spectrum, and they're in relationships with men who have no or partners who have no idea that they struggle, but they're dying on the inside. So it's terrible because it's like this double-headed monster. One head perceives threats everywhere, and the other is judging and shaming them for being less than and vulnerable to those feelings. Really, it sucks.
Yeah, you're torn. I mean, I hear so many parallels to patients who are dealing with substance use disorder. You're doing wonderful work. So really, that's amazing that you're a resource. I'm sure a lot of our listeners can identify with what you're saying. And it's great that they even, people have the insight to realize that they have this issue, but now there's also places to get help. So we'll certainly share this information with our listeners to take this quiz, to take this course. I highly recommend it. I think if people identify uh, with these feelings and these emotions, learning the skills necessary to feel better. And it's almost liberating too, especially if you're consumed by this and it's controlling you and it's impacting and affecting your relationships, your ability to work. Um, Unfortunately, it kind of takes control over you, right? And you're recognizing you've lost control is the first step. And but
Yeah.
now we're also being proactive here and presenting a solution, which are your resources. So if you're hearing this and identifying with it, know that there's a lot to be hopeful about and excited about. So uh, really appreciate you joining us today and sharing with us your insight. I know you're very busy, so Dr. Sterling, thank you for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Thank you very much for that excellent conversation, Dr. Sterling. Always enjoy chatting with you. Wish I could share with our listeners some of the conversations we've had offline. What's important for me to highlight here for our listeners is a lot of the times what you're exposed to with social media is a narrative that's controlled by somebody else. And they're framing that narrative. A lot of times it's unrealistic and you are taking in that information and responding to it. And it puts you in a position where you're very vulnerable because someone else now is controlling the way you're thinking. And what we try to do a lot of times in therapy is what's called cognitive reframing. And it's particularly interesting because usually in cognitive reframing, you're reframing your own thoughts. But with social media, someone else is trying to frame a certain image. You're responding to that image. And you actually have an opportunity here to reframe that image that they are trying to feed to you. And if you're able to hone in on that skill and realize how you can control the information you're ingesting, your response will therefore be impacted. So I think we have to first realize when we're talking about this obsessive jealousy, quote unquote, that Dr. Sterling so articulately described, we're thinking critically of what is the information that's coming into us, how are we interpreting that information, and other alternatives in terms of how we're interpreting that information that are more satisfying and easier for us to accept and tolerate. So I would say framing and reframing are really important things to think about when it comes to obsessive jealousy. And with social media, and what I really enjoyed about this conversation is we brought it a little bit to the world of addiction. As an addiction psychiatrist, it hit home. Harm reduction is something that is important to appreciate, and there are parallels in harm reduction models. The use of substance use and alcohol use isn't to maintain full abstinence. We actually recognize and acknowledge that using and relapsing are a part of the journey towards sobriety. And that could apply to a lot of things in life. Sure, harm reduction is a term that we use in addiction and substance use, but in a setting where somebody constantly feels negatively impacted by social media, I think being kind to themselves and recognizing that sometimes they will overindulge and might feel a certain way, but their goal is to limit their use and limit the negative impact, and know that they might oscillate from those highs and lows as they navigate that journey, and they're forgiving towards themselves is huge. So I hope that's a takeaway that some of our listeners appreciate as they're listening to this, and realize that harm reduction, which is a concept taken from addiction, is quite applicable here as well when we're talking about social media. The other thing I was thinking about is the younger generation and individuals talking about screen time and limiting access or not granting any access. And I want to highlight the importance of using things in moderation. It is a little bit cliche. We see this a lot when people talk about diet and exercise, but overcorrecting here could also have negative impacts, particularly if a child is responsible and of age and the parents feel comfortable with the content that they're watching. Those are important disclaimers to highlight. Um, Establishing a hard no and a hard boundary could backfire and could lead to an overcorrection where a child now insists on exploring what to them what was described as forbidden. So I think using things in moderation is important, monitoring is important, and educating is important, as setting the groundwork early to using social media responsibly. So Those are just some thoughts. Again, it was a pleasure having Dr. Sterling here today. Obviously, Dr. Sterling, you're always welcome to join us. And to our listeners, I appreciate your attention and I thank you as well and look forward to seeing you on an episode soon. Thank you for listening. Please follow us or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Please follow us at Mindful Care and at TikTok Psychiatrist for more. And don't forget to rate and review.